All right, Improvisation Center is back again, standing in front of the Dodge again. Now, if you've been following the progress of the engine rebuild, you'll have known we went through the whole thing from top to bottom, all the way to getting it in here. Now, one little thing we did discover when we did try to start this thing up was the idea that we had a leaky intake gasket. Bad enough of a problem that when the thing did start up and run, it pumped antifreeze through the water jackets where the leaks were at into the intake valley, which in turn put water into the oil, turning the oil into milkshake. Bad shit. So had to take the intake off, drain all the oil out and everything, put the new gaskets on instead of the regular paper, composite, whatever the gaskets are made of. We use the other version that mopars typically use, which is a metal stamped gasket with grooves in it and a shitload of gasket maker. That is literally how the gasket goes on. You put gasket maker on the intake, stick the metal stuff on there, and then put more gasket maker on the other side, slap it all together. Of course, you got the cork pieces on the front and back of the engine block, but other than that, it's just metal stamped gaskets with a lot of gasket maker. And that's what I used on the other engine with successful results. So of course I used that on this setup. When I tighten the bolts down, I kind of use the same concept that you use with cylinder heads, which is alternating from the inside out on bolts going back and forth to either side. Upon doing that, I discovered that some bolts that were snug would suddenly be loose after snugging down a bolt on the end, meaning that the intake was sort of twisting and all. And this is probably where we messed up at, because we didn't come back over every bolt, torquing them down a second time just to verify that everything was snug all across the board. This time we did that. And at that point, we were able to put fresh oil in there, start it up, and actually not have it mix water in the oil and make a mess and basically cause problems. So at this point, I'll go ahead and start this thing up again. I only did some light tuning in the very beginning when we started it up, just to kind of get it to where it'll stay running, but we'll get to see how it sounds when it starts up again. This thing hadn't really run for maybe a couple of minutes or so during that time because of the issues with the intake and all. And even after fixing everything, we still had to kind of fine tune everything and check to make sure everything was straight and not going to continue giving us problems. So set the choke there. Also have our headlights. Let me turn those off because we don't need to run them. Go ahead. As you can see, it actually starts up pretty quick. Obviously, you set the choke on these older engines that don't have electric chokes or none, but you can hear it's running. It's kind of got some little ticky sounds. That's because we got some thin oil in there. Really, I put some thin oil in there as a break-in oil. Probably going to end up changing this oil out very soon after running it a while, and then put some regular 1040 in there so it can actually operate like it's supposed to. You got to put that starting oil in there just to kind of clean all the shit from out of the engine, like dirt and grease from your hands and stuff like that. So it doesn't pay to use some A1 quality oil. Just use some cheap generic stuff, because you're going to probably change it out after maybe a grand total of an hour's worth of running time if you're like me. Some people have their own more detailed regimen for breaking in an engine, but I'm sure that also applies to specific kinds of performance engines and builds. We're just dealing with a stock setup here, so no real need to get too extensive in our break-in schedule. So yeah, cheap oil. It's like 530, 5W30. Like I said, I'll run this thing some, just let it kind of break itself in like that. Do any little fine tuning I need to do. Change that oil out, put some 1040 in there, and continue to run it. I'll probably run it light though until I change that oil again, and then I'll be able to actually drive like normal, which, contrary to what some people may think, does not mean beating the shit out of the car. So yeah, engine runs. It's got a little ticking and all. That's mainly because that 530 ain't really just pumping up through the thing too fast. But there is oil getting up to the top of the engine though. Now, as you can hear, exhaust sounds pretty good. Got some aftermarket Flowmasters on there. You don't see a lick of smoke coming out of this thing. No water, vapor, no oil burning, not a thing. So, on that note, come back to the front again. Got a little bit of smoke coming off the exhaust here, and that's of course because of oil residue and stuff like that, which is expected. Now, there's not a whole lot left we need to do to this thing before we could really start doing some road testing. I do have to get a little port right there for the brake booster because that plastic was so dry rotted it just snapped off and broke into a couple pieces. So if I want to have some working brakes, I will need to replace that component. And of course we did a couple headlights previously. We're waiting for the other headlights to come in so we can finish that up. Also in the process of making some door panels, temporarily of course, because as you can see, the only door panel we have here looks like shit. And replacement door panels are expensive as hell, so we really don't want to sit here with no door panels while we wait to save up money to buy replacements for that. So for the time being, I'm just going to go ahead, make some cheapo door panels that I cut from some plywood and put those on so I could at least cover the doors up, put the armrests back on, all that stuff, and be able to drive around somewhat comfortably. Now, also another thing I had to do on here was change the transmission oil pan gasket because it was brittle, it was leaky, and that's why I hate automatic transmissions, because it's hard to keep them from leaking. But I replaced that, cut the leaks down to a bare minimum. I think it's mainly coming from the dipstick tube, but that's a whole nother issue. Put some oil in there. Let me see if this thing goes into gear. As you can see, I ain't got no power brakes, so you gotta slam this thing down. But we have motion. Put this sucker back in park. Make sure it's in park. And yeah, these gauges are kind of questionable as far as functionality, but got the temperature gauge here fluttering around and all. I'm going to shut this thing off because I am really not 100% sure if that gauge is even accurate. More than likely it is not. Same thing with the oil pressure gauge and the jacked up alternator gauge. I'm going to have to replace all that shit, really. But until then, I'm going to turn this thing off and let this engine rest a little bit because it's been running pretty much most of this video. So until the next time, you know what to do. Click like, subscribe, notifications if you want to see and hear more of me again, and see more of this car again as we continue to make more progress and wrap things up with it. Well, not fully wrap things up, because if we really want to continue to restore it, it's going to take a while, but we're just trying to get to a point of being able to drive it around. So, again, until the next time, I will catch you later.